There are things in life that we never expect to question. Growing up, I thought I knew my family inside and out. I was raised by my grandfather, who seemed like the kindest man. He had this warmth, this protective nature that made me feel safe no matter what. But things began to change when I turned 14. Little by little, I started noticing things about him that didn't make sense, things that no one else seemed to notice. And slowly, a terrifying thought crept into my mind. I think my grandfather might be a serial killer. It all started one cold night a few weeks after my birthday. My grandfather had gone out, which wasn't unusual. He liked taking long drives late at night, saying it helped him clear his head. I never thought anything of it until that night. The house was silent, and I was watching TV when I heard a noise coming from the basement. It was a soft creak, like someone trying to be careful not to make a sound. Our basement had always been off limits. My grandfather had told me to never go down there, that it was just a place where he stored old junk and tools. But something about that night made me curious. I tiptoed to the basement door and pressed my ear against it. The sound was clearer now, like the shuffling of feet. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment I considered opening the door. But then, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. I quickly stepped back and hurried to my room, my curiosity mixing with fear. A few days later, I couldn't get the basement out of my mind. Every time I passed by the door, it called to me. My grandfather had always been a private person, but now it felt like he was hiding something from me, something dark. That night, when he went out again, I decided to do the unthinkable. I was going to see what was down there. I grabbed the spare key that he kept hidden under a floorboard in the living room. My hands shook as I unlocked the basement door and slowly pushed it open. The stairs creaked under my weight, and I could feel the cold air rushing up from below. As I descended, the smell hit me first, damp and musty, like something old and forgotten. There was a small light switch at the bottom of the stairs. I flicked it on, and the dim bulb hanging from the ceiling cast eerie shadows on the walls. The basement was cluttered with boxes, shelves full of tools, and old furniture covered in dust. But what caught my eye was a small room at the far end, its door locked with a heavy padlock. I didn't dare try to open the locked room. Instead, I searched through the boxes, trying to find something, anything that would explain the uneasy feeling I had. That's when I found the photos. Hidden beneath a pile of old clothes was an album filled with black and white photographs. At first glance, they looked like old family photos, but as I flipped through the pages, something felt wrong. The people in the pictures weren't smiling. In fact, they looked terrified. Some were tied up, others had bruises and cuts. My stomach turned, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Who were these people? And why did my grandfather have these photos? The more I thought about the photos, the more disturbed I became. I couldn't ask my grandfather about them, not without giving away that I'd been in the basement. So I decided to keep watching him. I noticed that his late-night drives were becoming more frequent. Every few nights he'd leave the house after dinner and wouldn't come back until the early hours of the morning. One night I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my jacket and followed him. I made sure to stay far enough behind that he wouldn't notice, but close enough that I could see where he was going. His car weaved through the empty streets until we reached the outskirts of town. He pulled into a dark, secluded area near the woods and parked his car. I hid behind a tree and watched as he opened the trunk of his car. I expected him to pull out tools or maybe groceries, but what I saw next made my blood run cold. He was dragging someone from the trunk. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. My grandfather was pulling a body from the trunk of his car. The person wasn't moving. I could barely see in the darkness, but it was clear enough to know that something terrible was happening. He dragged the body toward the trees, disappearing into the woods. For a long moment, I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and my heart pounded so hard that I thought it might burst out of my chest. Should I call the police? Should I run? My mind was racing, but I couldn't do anything except stand there, paralyzed with fear. After what felt like hours, my grandfather emerged from the trees, wiping his hands on a rag. He tossed the rag into the trunk, shut the door, and drove away like nothing had happened. The next morning, I couldn't look at my grandfather the same way. Every time I saw him, my mind replayed what I had seen the night before. He was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee like any other morning. But to me, he was a stranger now. I knew I had to confront him, but the words wouldn't come. How do you ask someone if they're a killer? How do you even start that conversation? "Grandpa," I finally said, my voice trembling, "what do you do when you go out at night?" He looked at me, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "I've told you before," he said calmly. "I take drives, helps me think." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "I followed you last night." The room fell silent. My grandfather's expression didn't change, but I could see something flicker in his eyes, something cold and calculating. He set his coffee cup down gently, too gently, like he was controlling his every movement. "What did you see?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "I saw you in the woods," I whispered. "I saw you dragging someone." His lips tightened, and for a moment I thought he was going to deny it, to tell me I had imagined the whole thing. But instead he leaned back in his chair, a strange smile curling at the edges of his mouth. "I knew this day would come," he said, his voice eerily calm. "I didn't think it would be so soon, but I suppose it was only a matter of time." My heart was pounding so loud that I could barely hear his words. What did he mean? What was he talking about? "I've done things," he continued, his eyes locking onto mine. "Things that you wouldn't understand, things that had to be done." The calmness in his voice sent chills down my spine. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, what I was starting to realize. My grandfather wasn't denying it, he was accepting it. He stood up from the table and walked over to the window, staring outside like he was lost in thought. "I've always protected this family," he said softly, almost as if he were talking to himself. "Sometimes protecting means making sacrifices, things you can't tell others about." "Protected from what?" I asked, my voice shaking. I didn't want to hear the answer, but I needed to know. He glanced back at me, his eyes dark and serious. "From people who deserved it," he whispered. "People who wouldn't be missed." I sat there, stunned, trying to make sense of what he was saying. Was he trying to justify it? Did he really believe that these people deserved to die? "Who were they?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The people in the photos. The people you—" I couldn't bring myself to say the word. He sighed deeply, walking over to the cupboard and pulling out a small, worn notebook. He flipped through the pages slowly before handing it to me. "These are the names," he said quietly. "People who did terrible things, things they never paid for. I found them, and I made sure they never hurt anyone again." I stared at the notebook in my hands, my mind racing. The pages were filled with names, dates, and notes, details about people who, according to my grandfather, had done unspeakable things. But who was he to decide? Who was he to play judge, jury, and executioner? "You can't be serious," I said, my voice breaking. "This isn't justice, this is murder." He didn't flinch at the word. Instead, he walked over to the stove and started making himself another cup of coffee, as if this was a normal conversation. "You think the world is black and white, don't you?" he said, stirring his cup. "But it's not. There are people out there who slip through the cracks. The police don't care, the courts don't care, but I did." I didn't know what to believe. Was my grandfather some kind of vigilante, or was he just a murderer, disguising his crimes as acts of righteousness? My head spun as I looked through the notebook, trying to understand the depth of what I had uncovered. But something didn't sit right with me. Even if these people were guilty, even if they had done terrible things, it wasn't his place to take their lives. And there was something else, something darker. The way he talked about it, the coldness in his voice, made me wonder if he enjoyed it. Over the next few days, I avoided my grandfather as much as possible. Every time I saw him, I felt sick to my stomach. I couldn't look at him the same way, not after what I had learned. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get the images out of my mind. The photos, the list, the body in the woods. Late one night, as I lay in bed, I heard footsteps outside my room. I froze, holding my breath as they stopped just outside my door. I could hear the faint sound of my grandfather's breathing, the soft creak of the floorboards as he stood there. What was he doing? Why was he standing outside my door in the middle of the night? I didn't move. I didn't even blink. My heart was racing so fast that I was sure he could hear it from the other side of the door. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, before I finally heard him walk away. The next morning, everything seemed normal. My grandfather was in the kitchen making breakfast like he always did, acting as though nothing had happened. But I knew better now. I couldn't trust him. I couldn't trust anything about him. I needed to find a way to stop him. I considered going to the police, but what would I say? I had no proof, no solid evidence, just my suspicions and a notebook full of names. And even if they believed me, what would happen next? My grandfather was the only family I had. If he went to prison, I'd be completely alone. But I couldn't just let this go. I couldn't live with the knowledge that he was out there doing these things, and I wasn't stopping him. One afternoon, when my grandfather went out on one of his drives, I picked up the phone and dialed the local police station. When the detective arrived at our house, I felt a wave of panic wash over me. What if my grandfather came home early? What if he found out what I was doing? But I couldn't back down now. I explained everything, about the photos, the locked room, the notebook, and the body in the woods. The detective listened carefully, taking notes, but I could tell he was skeptical. "We'll look into it," he said, but his tone made it clear that he didn't think much would come of it. "In the meantime, if you notice anything suspicious, don't hesitate to call." Days went by, and nothing happened. The police didn't come back, and my grandfather carried on as if nothing had changed. But I noticed little things, subtle changes in his behavior. He started watching me more closely, his eyes following me whenever I moved around the house. I tried to act normal, to pretend that I didn't suspect anything, but it was impossible. The tension was unbearable. Every time he left the house, I found myself wondering if this would be the night he got caught, or if it would be the night he came for me. One evening, my grandfather came home with a strange look in his eyes. He sat down at the table and handed me a slip of paper. On it was a name I didn't recognize. "I need your help," he said, his voice steady and calm. "This one's different." I stared at the paper, my heart pounding in my chest. Was he asking me to be a part of this now? Did he think I would help him? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My grandfather was actually asking for my help. He stared at me, waiting for an answer as if this was a normal request. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "I can't. I won't." His face darkened. For the first time, I saw a side of him I had never seen before. There was no warmth, no kindness, just cold, calculating intent. "You're already involved," he said softly. "You've seen the notebook, the photos. You know what I do. You know why." I stood up, my legs shaking. "I'm not like you," I said, my voice trembling. "I won't do this." He didn't respond, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying than anything he could have said. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that slip of paper with the name written on it. I saw the photos, the locked room, the body in the woods. I couldn't get away from it. Early the next morning, I found my grandfather sitting at the kitchen table, staring down at his cup of coffee. He didn't look at me when I entered the room. "If you won't help," he said quietly, "then stay out of my way." His words felt like a punch to the gut. I knew what he meant. If I interfered, there would be consequences. I had no choice but to wait and see what he would do next. The days that followed were the worst of my life. My grandfather's behavior grew more erratic, more intense. He would disappear for hours at a time, only to return with a cold, distant look in his eyes. I knew he was up to something, but I didn't know what. The detective hadn't followed up with me, and I was beginning to feel like I was completely on my own. My grandfather wasn't just someone I loved anymore. He was someone I feared. I had to find a way out, but I didn't know how. One evening, I heard him in his room talking to someone on the phone. His voice was low, but I caught enough to know that whatever he was planning, it wasn't good. I couldn't sit around and wait for my grandfather to strike again. I had to do something, anything, to stop him. I thought about going to the police again, but I didn't have any new evidence. I needed to catch him in the act. One night after he left the house, I decided to follow him. I waited until he was far enough ahead, then grabbed my jacket and quietly slipped out the door. My heart raced as I trailed behind him, staying in the shadows. I had no idea what I was going to find, but I had to know. I had to stop him. My grandfather drove for nearly an hour, winding through back roads and quiet streets. I kept my distance, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Finally, he pulled into a parking lot near a rundown building on the outskirts of town. I parked a few blocks away and watched as he got out of the car. He glanced around, making sure no one was watching, then disappeared into the building. I waited for a few minutes before getting out of my car and following him. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the building. Whatever he was doing in there, it wasn't good. The building was old and falling apart, the windows covered in grime. I slipped inside through a side door and found myself in a dimly lit hallway. My footsteps echoed off the walls as I crept forward, listening for any sound that might give away my grandfather's location. As I moved deeper into the building, I heard voices, muffled but unmistakable. My stomach churned as I realized that he wasn't alone. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to stay out of sight. I could hear my grandfather's voice, low and steady, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. The air was thick with tension. I inched closer, careful not to make a sound. As I peered around the corner, I saw my grandfather standing in the middle of the room talking to a man I didn't recognize. They were discussing something that made my blood run cold. "I need you to take care of it," my grandfather said, his voice calm and controlled. "No loose ends." The man nodded, pulling out a knife from his jacket. My heart stopped as I realized what was about to happen. They were planning to kill someone, maybe even tonight. I had to stop them, but I didn't know how. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. What could I do? If I confronted them, I'd be putting myself in danger. But if I did nothing, someone else would die. As I stood there, frozen with fear, I heard the door to the building creak open. My grandfather and the man were leaving, probably to carry out whatever horrific plan they had in mind. I had a choice to make. I could follow them, try to stop them before it was too late, or I could run, get as far away from this nightmare as possible. But deep down, I knew there was only one option. I had to do something. I followed them out of the building, keeping a safe distance as they made their way down the street. My mind raced with possibilities, trying to figure out how I could stop them without getting myself killed. They got into my grandfather's car and drove off, and I quickly jumped into my own car, trailing behind them. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized we were heading back toward the woods. This was it. Whatever they were planning to do, it was going to happen tonight. The car pulled to a stop at the edge of the forest, the same place where I had found the body all those weeks ago. My stomach twisted with fear as I parked a short distance away and watched them get out of the car. I crept through the trees, staying low and out of sight as they made their way deeper into the woods. The moonlight filtered through the branches, casting eerie shadows on the ground. I could hear their voices again, talking in low tones, but I couldn't make out the words. All I knew was that something terrible was about to happen. As I followed them through the woods, I realized that I had no plan. I didn't know how I was going to stop them, but I couldn't turn back now. Suddenly, they stopped. I crouched behind a tree, my heart racing as I watched them. My grandfather pulled something out of his jacket, a gun. Panic surged through me. I couldn't let this happen. Without thinking, I stepped out from behind the tree and shouted, "Stop!" My grandfather and the man both turned to look at me, surprise flashing across their faces. The man raised his knife and I saw my grandfather's hand tighten on the gun. "What are you doing here?" my grandfather growled, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm stopping you," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "This has to end." He stared at me for a long moment, then slowly lowered the gun. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "I'm doing this for you." I shook my head. "No, you're doing this for yourself. This isn't about protecting anyone, it's murder." The tension in the air was suffocating. My grandfather's eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite understand. The man beside him seemed confused, glancing back and forth between us. "You don't know what these people have done," my grandfather said. "You don't know the evil they've caused." "I don't care," I replied, my voice shaky but determined. "This isn't the way. You can't just decide who lives and who dies." For the first time, I saw doubt flicker in his eyes, but just as quickly it was gone. The man with the knife stepped forward, clearly impatient. "We don't have time for this," he snapped. "Let's finish this and get out of here." My grandfather hesitated, his grip tightening on the gun once more. I could see the inner battle he was fighting, the lines of his face hardening as he made his decision. "Grandpa," I whispered, stepping closer, "please don't do this." He looked at me, and for a moment I thought I saw something break in him. But then his expression hardened again. My grandfather's face twisted with emotion, but it was impossible to tell what he was thinking. The man beside him stepped forward, his knife gleaming in the moonlight. I could see that he was getting impatient, ready to end things. "Move out of the way," my grandfather said in a cold, detached voice. It was like he had already made up his mind and nothing I said could change it. "No," I replied firmly, my voice shaking. "If you're going to do this, you'll have to go through me." He didn't answer right away, but I could see his jaw tighten. There was no trace of the man who had once taught me how to ride a bike or tell stories by the fire. The man in front of me was a stranger, consumed by darkness. For a long moment, no one moved. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest that I could barely hear anything else. The man with the knife glanced at my grandfather, waiting for him to give the order. But my grandfather just stood there, his eyes locked on mine. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "This is the only way to make things right." I shook my head, fighting back tears. "There's nothing right about this." He lowered his gaze for just a second, and I saw something flicker across his face. Regret, maybe, or hesitation. But before I could say anything, the man with the knife lunged forward. I barely had time to react as the man rushed at me, his knife raised. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a tree root, and I fell hard to the ground. The man loomed over me and I braced myself for the worst. But just as he was about to strike, my grandfather stepped forward and grabbed his arm. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice full of anger and desperation. The man looked shocked, his eyes wide with confusion. "What are you doing?" he spat. "We had a deal." My grandfather's grip tightened on the man's arm. "I said stop." The man with the knife yanked his arm away, glaring at my grandfather. "You're getting soft," he sneered. "This is what we came here for." "I said stop," my grandfather repeated, his voice low and dangerous. I could see the tension between them rising, and for a moment I thought my grandfather might actually back down. But then the man lunged at him. In the blink of an eye, everything spiraled out of control. My grandfather reacted on instinct, raising the gun and pulling the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the trees, and the man crumpled to the ground, clutching his chest. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the earth. Time seemed to stop as the reality of what had just happened sank in. The man lay motionless on the ground, his eyes wide open but lifeless. My grandfather stood over him, the gun still smoking in his hand. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak. All I could do was stare at the scene in front of me, unable to process the fact that my grandfather had just killed someone, right in front of me. He slowly lowered the gun, his hands shaking. "I didn't want to," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." We stood there in the silence for what felt like an eternity, neither of us knowing what to do next. The man's body lay still on the ground, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. "What have you done?" I finally managed to choke out, my voice breaking. My grandfather didn't answer right away. He just stared down at the gun in his hand as if it had betrayed him. "I had no choice," he murmured. "He was going to kill you." I shook my head, tears welling up in my eyes. "This is all wrong. None of this should have happened." My grandfather's face was pale, and I could see the weight of what he had done settling on him. "We need to get out of here," he said quietly. "We can't stay." I stood frozen, torn between wanting to run as far away as possible and knowing that I couldn't just leave this behind. "What about him?" I asked, my voice trembling as I pointed to the body on the ground. My grandfather didn't answer right away. He just stared at the lifeless man, his expression hardening. "We'll take care of it," he said finally, his voice cold and detached. "No one has to know." We moved quickly, working in silence. My grandfather knew exactly what to do, how to make it look like the man had never been there. I followed his instructions, numb to everything that was happening around me. As we buried the body deep in the woods, my mind raced with questions. How had things gone so wrong? How had my grandfather become this person, a killer, willing to do anything to cover his tracks? But I couldn't ask him. Not now. We were both too far in, and there was no turning back. By the time we got back to the house, the sun was starting to rise. The sky was a soft pink, a stark contrast to the darkness that had settled over my heart. I felt like I was in a daze, unable to process everything that had happened. My grandfather didn't say a word as we walked inside. He headed straight for his room, leaving me standing in the kitchen, alone with my thoughts. I sank into a chair, my mind racing. I couldn't stay here anymore. I couldn't live with this secret. But what could I do? If I went to the police, my grandfather would go to prison, or worse. The next few days passed in a blur. My grandfather barely spoke to me, and when he did, it was short and clipped. The warmth that had once defined our relationship was gone, replaced by a cold, uncomfortable tension. I couldn't look at him without seeing the man he had become, the man who had killed to protect his secrets. And I couldn't look at myself without feeling the weight of my own complicity. I had helped him. I had buried the body. I didn't know who we were anymore. One evening, as we sat in silence at the dinner table, I couldn't take it anymore. The guilt, the fear, it was all too much. "I can't do this," I said suddenly, my voice breaking the silence. My grandfather looked up, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" "I can't live like this," I continued, my voice shaking. "I can't keep this secret. We killed someone. You killed someone. And I helped you cover it up." He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes dark and empty. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "I did it for you." I stood up from the table, my hands trembling with anger and fear. "No," I said firmly. "You did it for yourself. You've been doing this for years, haven't you? All those people, all those names in your notebook, they weren't just bad people. They were innocent." My grandfather's face twisted with emotion. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know enough," I snapped. "I know that you've been killing people and now you want me to be part of it. But I won't. I can't." For the first time, my grandfather looked truly defeated. My grandfather stood up, his hands clenched into fists. "You don't understand," he shouted, his voice filled with rage. "I've been protecting this family. Everything I've done was for us, for you." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "I never asked for this. I never wanted this." The room fell into a heavy silence. My grandfather's shoulders slumped and he turned away from me, his back to the room. "I'm leaving," I said quietly. "I can't stay here anymore." He didn't respond. That night I packed my bags. I didn't have a plan. I just knew I had to get away. The house that had once been my safe haven now felt like a prison, and I couldn't stay any longer. I waited until I was sure my grandfather was asleep before quietly slipping out the front door. The air was cold and the world outside felt different, brighter somehow, despite everything that had happened. As I drove away from the house, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. My grandfather's house disappeared into the distance, and with it, a part of my life that I could never get back. Even though I had left the house, I couldn't escape the guilt. It clung to me like a shadow, following me wherever I went. I had left my grandfather behind, but the weight of what we had done together still weighed heavily on my conscience. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man's lifeless body, the blood pooling around him, and every time I opened them, I saw my grandfather's face, his cold, empty eyes staring back at me. One night, as I sat in a cheap motel room trying to make sense of everything, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something told me to answer it. "Hello?" I said, my voice hoarse from days of silence. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before a familiar voice spoke. "I'm sorry," my grandfather said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know how to respond. The phone call from my grandfather left me feeling more conflicted than ever. I wanted to forgive him. I wanted to believe that he could change, that things could go back to the way they were. But deep down, I knew that wasn't possible. The weight of what we had done would always be there, a haunting reminder of the darkness that had consumed us both. I hung up the phone without saying another word. Days turned into weeks, and still, I couldn't shake the feeling that my grandfather's house was calling me back. There was unfinished business there, something that needed to be resolved. So one morning I got into my car and drove back to the place where everything had changed. The house looked the same, but it felt different. Cold, empty, like a shell of what it once was. I walked inside, half expecting to find my grandfather waiting for me, but the house was silent. He was gone, and for the first time I realized that I was truly free.